the President addresses Congress and the nation.
Good evening. Dan Rather reporting from CBS News World Headquarters in New York. It is 9 days now since terrorists on a mission of murder turned commercial jetliners into missiles and took down the World Trade Towers in New York and tore open the Pentagon in Washington. Estimates of the dead, missing, and injured now total more than 13,000. Casualties in a new kind of war. Very shortly, President George W. Bush will appear before the United States Congress, meeting in joint session and a nationwide television audience, to say how the United States will fight this war and to ask for public patience and support. A defining moment in the history of this nation and the Bush presidency.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed and together without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government.
Let me follow up by asking, do you think that the CIA and military intelligence agencies and the FBI have used the emergency provisions, both in law and by emergency agency, the Federal Preparedness Agency it's called now, to have contingency plans which threaten the liberty of American citizens?
Mr. Rowan, in due course the committee will pass judgment on those questions. I'm not going to pre-guess the committee or prematurely attempt to pass judgment on this program. But let me tell you this. In the need to develop a capacity to know what potential enemies are doing, the United States government has perfected a technological capability that enables us to monitor the messages that go through the air. These messages are between ships at sea. They can be between units, military units in the field. We have a very extensive capability of intercepting messages wherever they may be in the airwaves. Now that is necessary and important to the United States as we look abroad at enemies or potential enemies. We must know. At the same time, that capability at any time could be turned around on the American people. And no American would have any privacy left. Such is the capability to monitor everything. Telephone conversations, telegrams, it doesn't matter. There would be no place to hide if this government ever became a tyranny, if a dictator ever took charge in this country. The technological capacity that the intelligence community has given the government could enable it to impose total tyranny. And there would be no way to fight back. Because the most careful effort to combine together in resistance to the government, no matter how privately it was done, is within the reach of the government to know. Such is the capability of this technology. Now, why is this investigation important? I'll tell you why. Because I don't want to see this country ever go across the bridge. I know the capacity that is there to make tyranny total in America. And we must see to it that this agency and all agencies that possess this technology operate within the law and under proper supervision, so that we never cross over that abyss. That's the abyss from which there is no return.
Hey everybody. Welcome to the Patreon series on the War on Terror. My name's William Ingalls. I am the host and one-man band of Hemlock. This is a series I've been wanting to do for a very long time because this series is the backdrop of my childhood. I was 4 years old when 9/11 happened. I was 13, I guess, when Chelsea Manning was thrown in prison and the WikiLeaks documents were made available to the public. I was 15 or 16 when Edward Snowden was releasing the PRISM files and showing mass surveillance in the United States. I remember as a middle schooler watching the Iraq insurgency unfold and watching IEDs go off and roadside bombs that would blow Humvees 50 feet into the air and body parts coming down as they fell. But as a kid, none of this made any sense to me. None of it could be placed in a context that I was able to understand, and so I had something of an attitude of learned helplessness towards it. I spent a lot of time with adults, and all of them had opinions, had perspectives, but it seemed clear to me, even at the time, that nobody could stitch together why any of this was really happening. If we were after bin Laden in Afghanistan, why did we occupy the country for 20 years when he left and crossed the border into Pakistan in the first 3 weeks of combat? If Iraq was about weapons of mass destruction and support for international terrorism and the connection between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden, and then all of that turned out to be false, and they knew it was false to begin with, then what, in fact, was the Iraq War really about? What, if not facing down an existential threat to democracy and our way of life and so forth, if it wasn't about that, then why were we there? These are the questions that I decided to go back as a scholar, as a researcher, as a huge obsessive and lover of history, and try and find out the answers to myself. And so that's what this podcast is. And so now, without any further ado, allow me to present episode 1 of the War on Terror series, The Dark Mirror. So, did our government become a tyranny? That's the question that is left unanswered in that interview from 1975 with Senator Frank Church. He lays out very explicitly the sorts of capabilities that the government was building, which in 1975, the era before modern internet communications and so forth, the very beginnings even of real computation. Church is concerned, even then, that the capabilities that domestic surveillance agencies are perfecting abroad in our prosecution of the Cold War against the Soviets will be turned in classic imperial style, first towards the marginal elements within the population. For example, using enhanced surveillance technology to wiretap civil rights leaders or organized labor, or use it to conduct political surveillance against official enemies. The capabilities start out and are proven, first and foremost, against those people that are most vulnerable or susceptible to state force. But inevitably, the technology, the capability, the protocols put in place to work against the most challenging sectors of the population from the government's point of view are generalized in such a form that they are applied in dragnet fashion to everyone. I mean, after all, if you construct a device which can take 2 phone numbers, for example, and record any conversation made between those 2 phone numbers in 1975, well, then it's a matter of scale and simplicity simply to tap every telephone conversation, regardless of which number it's coming from and which number it's going out towards. And that may result in a massive pileup of irrelevant data, or if you're interested in something as quaint as the Constitution data that was collected illegally. But that's a problem that can be solved later in analysis. Right now, you have every possible connection laid out before you, and as an FBI investigator or someone charged with solving a murder, that can provide you with a sense that you have the tools that you need to fulfill your role within law enforcement. You might fight tooth and nail in court as a federal prosecutor, local detective, etc., to have access, say in 1975, to that massive phone bank. And perhaps you would be right to, if access to this enormous trove of recorded phone calls could conceivably lead to catching a serial rapist, someone who kidnaps children, someone with a bloody record of 8 hit-and-run deaths and so forth, then it would be on the ACLU or something to show why such a collection scheme is more harm than good. But did they do this? Did they proceed with the logical necessity, the capability to turn this vast apparatus against dissidents within the United States? The answer is yes. And in order to show how yes the answer is, I would really like to play for you a clip from Barton Gellman's book, Dark Mirror, Edward Snowden and the American Surveillance State. And it is something of a long excerpt that I'm about to read, but it illustrates more perfectly than any overview I could give the sorts of risks that are manifestly incumbent upon anyone who decides to research or speak or teach others this material. So here we go. In 2013, the Washington Post journalist Barton Gellman was given an encrypted archive of NSA secrets by the ex-government contractor Edward Snowden. Inside the vault of classified documents were heavily protected state secrets, the locations of intercept depots, the names and pictures of deep-cover DIA and CIA operatives, an encyclopedia of technical manuals and espionage methods that laid out in precise flowchart detail how the domestic surveillance agency had ripped the phone, email, text, geolocation, and metadata communication of American citizens off of the wire and stored it permanently in massive database files that could be cross-referenced, reanalyzed, and ultimately used to create dossiers and law enforcement profiles on anyone. Hidden on this hard drive were the secrets of a vast and sophisticated spying apparatus, a network of backdoors, decryption exploits, malware payloads, all capable of targeting anyone in the country, as well as the required legal memos, classified presidential directives, and secret interpretations of the Fourth Amendment that allowed the NSA vast privileges in gathering up the private information of American citizens, including the contacts in their phone, the contents of their emails, their shopping history, all of the places they traveled to, and all of the pictures that they sent to their friends. It was, as Gelman himself called it, Pandora's box. And inside were many wonders and many horrors. What the investigative journalist was surprised to find in the folder structure of the NSA trove was his own name, Gelman Barton, stamped on a series of classified reports and project plans. I quote now from Gelman's memoir and reportage, Dark Mirror, Edward Snowden and the American Surveillance State. Quote, "As I made my way through the NSA archive, I came across my own name in the documents. I gawped at the screen and bit back an impulse to swear. The jolt of alarm felt naive. I knew perfectly well that government agencies prefer not to read their secrets on the front page. Sometimes they resent a story enough to investigate. How in blazes did the reporter find that out? In serious cases, maybe the Justice Department steps in. I knew all that, but I had not often felt it personally. Until Snowden upended my professional life, I seldom imagined myself a target of special attention. I put time and thought into protecting people who spoke to me in confidence, but the risks felt abstract. Most of the time, I lacked conviction that anybody was watching. I had skimmed the first page of this document and set it aside in the first tumultuous weeks after receiving the NSA archive. More than 2 months passed before I returned to the memo and noticed my name on page 7. The document that proved me wrong was more than a decade old, a top secret comment or con no foreign memorandum for the Attorney General of the United States about, quote, unauthorized disclosures of high-level concern to U.S. policymakers, end quote. 3 of my stories, the memo said, had been referred to the Justice Department for criminal investigation in early 1999. A sensation of exposure crawled up my spine. The FBI had been put on the case. I had no inkling at the time. How much did the Bureau find out? The memo did not say. No harm, as far as I knew, had come to my sources, but I realized that in some cases I could not really say. It had been a long time. I was in good journalistic company. Other bylines on the list included New York Times correspondents James Risen and Don Van Natta Jr., Washington Post reporters Doug Farah, Steve Muffson, Thomas Lippman, and Kathy Sawyer, and the New Yorker's Seymour Hersh. The roster could have been a lot longer. It's not easy to write about diplomacy or war without touching on something classified, and the accounting, I noted, stopped a few weeks after 9/11. Many of us on this list did our deepest digging into national security in the decade that followed. I had to assume that my subsequent work may have come under an FBI microscope more than once. In the 3 stories singled out in this memo, I described an intelligence operation gone wrong in the aftermath of the Gulf War of 1990 to 91. Back then, Iraq really did have a nuclear weapons development program and an arsenal of biological and chemical munitions. 7 years after the war, United Nations arms inspectors were still finding remnants. I skip forward a bit. According to the NSA Compromise Assessment Report, my reporting, quote, disclosed the basic concept for a highly classified NSA collection system, as well as Iraqi diplomatic communications. This communication system was inactive prior to the disclosure, and no efforts were made to regain access due to the increased risk following the media disclosure. A report of this disclosure was made to the Department of Justice. Gelman continues, the most intriguing part of the memo was the framing of the harm that the NSA ascribed to my stories. The harm fell into a category called denial and deception. That is, a counterintelligence term of art for keeping valuable secrets away from prying eyes. The lessons of history, the NSA wrote, suggest that, quote, press leaks could result in our adversaries implementing denial and deception, D&D, practices, end quote. If adversaries know how the United States spies on them, in other words, they can do a better job of covering their tracks. That is a legitimate concern, but there's a flip side. Good journalism sometimes exposes deception by the US government itself, not only in tradecraft, but also in matters of basic policy and principle. The Clinton administration publicly defended the UN Special Commission in Iraq's impartiality, even as it turned out the inspectors were unwitting spies. My coverage of the ensuing meltdown revealed the strategic price of subverting an international mission for tactical gain. Exposure of this betrayal, on the American side, from the NSA's point of view, constituted a crime. A whole folder in the Snowden archive was devoted to denial and deception. It was not about foreign spies. The counterintelligence adversaries in these documents were journalists and the people who gave us information. The memos and slide decks laid out the grave dangers posed by news reporting in theory and practice. They also sketched the beginnings of a plan to do something about it. National security was a playing field on which the government was at the peak of its advantage over journalists. U.S. elected and appointed officials held more power here than on any other subject to prevent, discourage, shape, and punish unwelcome disclosures. And when it came to the Snowden story, my own government might not even be the most serious threat. My reporting took place in a perilous environment, and I never had the luxury of forgetting that." End quote. Gilman says, at the very end there, that he never had the luxury of forgetting that he was, in fact, the target of U.S. government surveillance. But in many ways, the general American public, the citizenry, normal people, in other words, as opposed to national security investigative journalists, they did have the luxury of forgetting about Edward Snowden and the NSA and the PRISM program and mass surveillance. They probably don't know what the Fourth Amendment says regarding the government's need to obtain warrants in order to perform reasonable searches and seizures, and that the people are to be secure in their letters, persons, and communications. So Gelman's story raises the question, how would you behave if you knew, not merely suspected, but knew for a fact, the way that Gelman knew for a fact after finding his name in the NSA archive? How would you behave if you knew that the government was spying on you? If you knew that they were tapping your phone calls, reading your emails, pulling your location data from Google Maps, accessing your text messages to friends, and so on? If you knew that you had no form of privacy, would it change your behavior? I want to introduce a term that was brought up by a British 19th century philosopher named Jeremy Bentham, and that term is the panopticon. Now, why am I taking it in this particularly esoteric sounding direction? The answer is that this question has a history, and it has a history with the empire that was most influential on the subject of our real discussion, which is, of course, the American Empire and the War on Terror. But before America and before the War on Terror, there was the British Empire, the globe-bestriding colossus upon which the sun never set. And in order to regulate and control an empire of that scale, which had never been accomplished before in all of human history, it was something that the historian Alfred McCoy called a world order, of which there have only been three. The Spanish world order, which began with the conquest of the Western Hemisphere and the looting of the gold and silver, especially from what is today Mexico, and the construction of a trans-global colonial empire based on conquest and slavery. That's the first world order. The Second World Order, of course, is the British Empire, which accomplished much the same effect, but also managed to expand control to Africa, the East Indies, what today is Indonesia, all over the world, India, and so forth. But these two previous world orders, regimes of power that structured the connections between all the nations on the planet simultaneously, these two world orders yielded to the American world order, which is the bread and butter of what this podcast is about. But to return to the British, they were facing down this task of how do we create an administrative system that can run a place like India, which is many thousands of miles away, speaking a foreign language in which we have only a small number of viceroys and soldiers and mercenaries to control, intimidate, confuse, distract, pacify an enormous population which will become restive and violent if we allow it. And so part of how the British began to answer this question of how do we create a command and control structure capable of overseeing a place far away like India is they began to ask themselves a series of questions about human nature. And one of the questions they asked themselves very insistently about human nature is, what happens to people when they know they are being watched? And the first person, I think, to provide a decent account of what happens to people when they're watched was the British philosopher Jeremy Bentham, to whom we now turn. So Bentham was the founder of utilitarian moral philosophy, which is the particularly British belief system which states that the difference between good and evil can in fact be summed up in a series of mathematical equations in which pleasure is placed on one side and pain or suffering on the other, and the moral choice in any particular situation is simply to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. So Bentham was the forerunner of this, to my mind, extremely depraved and fundamentally broken form of thinking about what is good for a human being. But one of his other hobbies, apparently, and you would want to ask if you found out that your friend had a hobby like this, what you might be inclined to think about his state of mind. Bentham's other hobby was that at one point he thought about the ideal design of a prison, because in addition to being a moral philosopher, Jeremy Bentham was also an architect. And so he looked around at the prison systems in England at the time, in the 19th century, and thought he could do one better. So here's what he came up with. Imagine a giant cylinder cut into the earth. And in the center of this cylinder, there is a giant tower that stretches up directly in the middle, like a lighthouse. And at the top, there is an opening such that anyone who is at the top of this little lighthouse-like structure could rotate all around them 360 degrees and see everything. Now, as the person in the tower is looking at the walls of this cylinder cut out of the earth, we can imagine, you must picture cells that are cut into the earth in such a way that the only opening of the cell, the only part of the cell which takes in light, is facing towards this central guard tower, or panopticon. Panopticon means, essentially, the ability to see everything. And so these cells are laid out in around this central guard tower. And at no point does the prisoner inside of this cell have the ability to avoid surveillance. There is no part of their cell, or in fact no part of the prison itself, which is free from the surveilling gaze of whoever happens to be at the center. And Bentham's thought was that this prison, this panopticon design, would actually be a more humanitarian, a more moral and effective form of prison, because rather than using physical terror, beatings, restraints, torture, and so forth, to control prisoners, the way through which prisoners would be controlled instead would be the terror of surveillance, knowing that the people who put them in prison in the first place were watching, or at least potentially watching, their every move, meant that these prisoners could be kept on their best behavior, standing outside their cells at roll call, walking in straight, silent, single-file lines to mess, keeping their hands to themselves, and so forth, all because they could never tell when or if they were being watched, but knew at every moment that they could be watched. And the terror of that, the anxiety of that particular feeling, is what led to the creation of the term the panopticon effect. In order to get a sense for what the panopticon effect does to people, I would encourage you to remember the last time that you were out in public, or the last time that you thought you were alone by yourself in a certain place, and you had that distinct sensation that someone was watching you. And it's even more apropos if you don't know exactly who or why. For Gelman, when he discovered his name in this list of documents, he called it a sensation of exposure, which I thought was an interesting way to frame it. But we all know that feeling, right? It's a feeling of pins and needles. It's a feeling of adrenaline, your heart rate accelerating, perhaps the beginning of a cold sweat or a slight headache. But then you have to imagine not just the acute sensation of this experience, but also fundamentally how that experience would cool into an entirely different state of mind as you become accepting of the fact that that gaze, that eye of Sauron-like attention being paid to you from who knows where and who knows why and who knows who, as you begin to accept that that is just the way things work now. There will always be that attention paid to you. And so as that feeling goes away, how does your behavior change? Do you forget that it's even happening and go on in a state of semi-blissful semi-ignorance? Do you become paranoid and begin to suspect that the government is participating in covert forms of interference? I have known people, talked to them personally, who have become so paranoid about surveillance that they think that when they get stuck in traffic, that it is the government interfering with them. That when a helicopter flies over their head and messes up their line of thinking, that that is the government messing with them, and so forth. And it's easy to see, especially once more and more is learned about the government's capabilities, to fall victim to this form of self-reinforcing paranoia. Another way in which you could change your behavior, and I think this is the major way in which people change their behavior in response to surveillance, is to become more docile, is to shy away from difficult or subversive conversation topics, to avoid mentioning organizations like the NSA or torture programs like Phoenix or the Guantanamo Bay, talking about the CIA, talking about assassinations and so forth. People in public, when I have been foolish enough to attempt to talk to regular people about this in public, as soon as you begin to mention certain deep, dark facts about how the government really works, or how these, what I would call paragovernmental organizations like the CIA function, you see, and it's quite appropriate to see this on their face, actually, a look of recoil and horror, because in whatever surveillance regime we live in, whether it's an extremely detailed 6 guys in an FBI van following you everywhere, or just even the most casual 1 in 1,000 chance of surveillance getting picked up by somebody's speakerphone, nobody, quite appropriately, wants to be associated with criticism, discussion, knowledge of these subjects. And so, at first, in overt ways, people making up their mind to simply avoid discussing certain things. And then in more subtle and eventually forgotten ways, people begin to self-censor. And this is how the term the panopticon effect was coined. Security researchers at places like the Electronic Frontier Foundation noticed that if you gave a group of people or a person an indication, proof, could be a leaked document, a journalistic story, catching surveillance going on in the act. If you gave someone proof that they were being spied on some amount of the time, maybe 1%, maybe 70%, who knows, but definitely some amount of the time they are under surveillance, they act and speak not as if there's a chance that they're under surveillance at any given time, but they act like they're under surveillance all of the time. You know, if there was a security camera somehow in your house and it turned on for 5 minutes at random on any particular day, would you allow yourself to do compromising things ever, knowing that at any particular moment, a moment not known to you, that camera could be on and watching? And the answer is probably no. That would be the rational choice, in fact. But what this means is that when we get disclosures, real-world ones, not thought experiments, when we find out from the PRISM, P-R-I-S-M documents that Edward Snowden released, when we read books like Dark Mirror by Gelman and so forth, and learn about the overwhelming systematic capabilities of the NSA to reach down into every aspect of our lives, which is increasingly digital, and store, collect information on us, just as if the mafia had broken into your house and planted a bug under your lamp and could record all of your conversations with your friends, all of the business transactions going on in your home, the sound of you having sex with someone else, and so forth. In the exact same manner, except even more intrusive and complete, the NSA has surrounded the American population with a vast and powerful net of collection and surveillance. And so we all know this, or we would know it if we cared to check. And so the most natural question you can ask is, given that this exists, what can we expect the people who are operating on the other side of what Gelman calls the dark mirror? In other words, a two-way mirror, like the kind used in criminal interrogations, where someone can see you, but you can't see them, another metaphor for the panopticon. So who's on the other side of the mirror? What is the character, the intentions, the capabilities of these people? And here I believe history provides a few interesting examples of what we might expect from the other side of this dark mirror. So I want to begin with a historical example from the good old days, you might call them, of the FBI, when the FBI's leading concern in life was the covert, monolithic, and ruthless communist conspiracy, which was infiltrating every aspect of American life, from the State Department to labor unions and so forth. That's sarcasm, in case we're still getting to know each other. But back in the good old days of the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, a major preoccupation of the FBI was surveilling civil rights leaders. And, of course, there was no bigger and more influential civil rights leader than Martin Luther King Jr. And because the Black freedom struggle in the United States often rubbed elbows with the labor movement, a major threat to U.S. organized capital, the state police, the FBI, which was essentially founded in order to crush left-wing political activity in the United States, targeting groups like the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, aka the Wobblies and so forth, harassing labor unions, eventually expelling people like Emma Goldman from the country and Big Bill Haywood. So the FBI begins life as essentially a federal police agency / Pinkerton thug network designed to break up groups of striking workers, surveil, deport, arrest anybody who is suspected of having left-wing or communist or socialist political leanings. And it continued quite assiduously in this mission under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, whose greatest obsession in life by far was communism. So, under J. Edgar Hoover, there was a new FBI program called COINTELPRO, COINTELPRO. And COINTELPRO was a collection of dirty tricks, surveillance, black propaganda, covert interference, blackmail, ran and operated by the FBI against the Nation of Islam, Minister Farrakhan, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., James Baldwin, basically anyone who mattered to the civil rights movement had a file under COINTELPRO. And the victims of this program would be followed from place to place, wiretapped both in their homes and their offices, as well as any motel rooms that they stayed at. They would be blackmailed. They would be threatened and harassed by ununiformed FBI goons on the streets who would approach them and deliver exotic but very clear threats against them and their lives and their families. And COINTELPRO ran day to day by a guy named William Sullivan, who was the deputy FBI director under J. Edgar Hoover. And we don't know for sure that he wrote this letter to Martin Luther King Jr. that I'm about to read to you, but the historian Beverly Gage, who wrote the definitive book on J. Edgar Hoover called G-Man, which I would encourage anyone with an interest to read. It is extremely well written, and I think won a number of awards. But anyway, the historian and writer Beverly Gage discovered this letter in 2014 and seems to think it more likely than not that it was written by William Sullivan. And so this is a letter that was produced after the FBI had wiretapped the motel rooms that Martin Luther King Jr. was staying at, and had taken those tapes of him allegedly having sex with other people, and then put those tapes in the mail and sent them to his wife, along with this letter, which I will now read to you. Quote, King, in view of your low-grade, abnormal personal behavior, I will not dignify your name with either a Mr. or a Reverend or a Doctor. and your last name calls to mind only the type of king such as Henry VIII and his countless acts of adultery and immoral conduct lower than that of a beast. King, look into your heart. You know you are a complete fraud and a great liability to all of us Negroes. Aside, this would be a white person pretending to be a black person writing this letter. White people in this country have enough frauds of their own, but I am sure they don't have one at this time that is anywhere near your equal. You are no clergyman, and you know it. I repeat, you are a colossal fraud and an evil, vicious one. You could not believe in God and act as you do, believe in any personal moral principles. King, like all frauds, your end is approaching. You could have been our greatest leader. You, even at an early age, have turned out to be not a leader, but a dissolute, abnormal, moral imbecile. Your honorary degrees, your Nobel Prize, what a grim farce, and other awards will not save you. King, I repeat, you are done. No person can overcome facts, not even a fraud like yourself. Lend your sexually psychotic ear to the enclosure. You will find yourself in all your dirt, filth, evil, and moronic talk exposed on the record for all time. I repeat, no person can argue successfully against facts. You are finished. You will find on the record for all time your filthy, dirty, evil companions, male and females, giving expression with you to your hideous abnormalities, and some of them to pretend to be ministers of the gospel. Satan could do no more. What incredible evilness! It is all there on the record, your sexual orgies. Listen to yourself, you filthy, abnormal animal. You are on the record. You have been on the record. All your adulterous acts, your sexual orgies extending far into the past. King, there's only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You have just 34 days in which to do. This exact number has been selected for a specific reason. It has definite practical significance. You are done. There is but one way out for you. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation. End quote. So to summarize, going on the best historical lead that we have for authorship of this document, the second most powerful state police official in the United States personally wrote a letter to Martin Luther King Jr., encouraging him to kill himself before blackmail and compromise that was illegally obtained by wiretapping his motels is released to the public. So this represents one sort of person who has the ability to act from behind the dark mirror that we mentioned earlier. This right here is one potential solution to the question of what kind of person exactly could be watching me. Another potential solution to the question of what sort of individual could be surveilling me is given in this account, which comes from the Frank Church Committee hearings. So at the beginning, the gentleman that you heard from giving the interview on NBC's Meet the Press in 1975, that was the Idaho Senator Frank Church, who created, in response to allegations of illegal CIA domestic activity, he created an investigatory commission, which would eventually be called the Church Committee, where he dredged up, among other things, indications of CIA mind control and torture programs carried out against American citizens, which is called MK Ultra, and also discovered extensive collaboration between the CIA and organized crime, such as the Jewish mob and the Sicilian mafia, discovered important CIA drug trafficking links into Southeast Asia, most especially in Laos and Cambodia, and also discovered a covert cooperation or interaction with the FBI under something that would eventually be codenamed chaos. And all CIA activity, by the way, in the domestic sphere is illegal. The CIA's charter, its founding documentation, states explicitly that all CIA activity is to occur purely overseas and to have no domestic component. So in exposing Operation Chaos, which was like the FBI's COINTELPRO, a domestic CIA operation directed against Students for a Democratic Society, the anti-war movement in general, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Again, it's all the usual suspects here for the target of the government's shit list. Leftist groups, pacifists, civil rights advocates, queer and transgender people, anyone who is remotely interested in labor or unions. These are the sorts of people that the government directs the Eye of Sauron against, according to, in part, the discoveries made by the Church Committee. Well, part of the Church Committee was hearing testimony from paid FBI informants. So these are people that the FBI is allowing to carry on illegal activity under their protection and on their payroll. You know, they are paid a monthly salary to report back to the FBI. And one of those people got to testify before the Church Committee and insisted on wearing what he normally liked to wear while he was on the FBI payroll, which is a white KKK mask over his face with the eyes cut out so that he could see and talk. And so this FBI informant, who was testifying in the mid-70s before Congress, got to tell a story about how while he was on the FBI payroll, he witnessed and even participated in the beatings of the Freedom Riders as they pushed into the South in order to secure voting rights for African Americans, and that he had told both the FBI and the local police and the sheriffs that the KKK and other white supremacist hate groups were planning violence against the civil rights protesters as soon as they arrived, that a horrible beating was imminent, and that not only did the FBI and the local police, not only did they not do anything, they actually granted an exclusive time window in which they would allow these white terrorist mobs to severely beat the civil rights activists. And so here is that testimony right now.
Real America is looking into the activities 40 years ago of the Church Committee, which did a broad examination of the work of the FBI, the CIA, and the NSA. Today, as we continue, we're going to be looking at testimony of two FBI informants before the committee. From December 2nd, 1975, we're going to show you a clip of a Ku Klux Klan FBI informant by the name of Thomas Rowe. He described how he participated in beatings of civil rights activists during the Freedom Riders movement in Birmingham, Alabama. Let's watch.
Right. In connection with the Freedom Riders incident that you mentioned, did you inform the FBI about planned violence prior to that incident?
Sir, I gave the FBI information pertaining to the Freedom Riders assault approximately 3 weeks before it occurred.
And what did you tell him?
I stated to him that I had been contacted by a Birmingham city detective who in turn wanted me to meet with a high-ranking officer of the Birmingham Police Department to set a reception for the Freedom Riders.
You mean the Birmingham policeman set up the beating of the Freedom Riders and you told the FBI that?
That's correct, sir.
And then were they beaten?
They were beaten very badly, yes.
And did the Birmingham police give you the time that they promised to give you to perform the beating?
Yes, sir. We were promised 15 minutes with absolutely no intervention from any police officer whatsoever. The information was passed on to the Bureau. They We had our 15 minutes. Approximately 15 minutes after the Freedom Riders were attacked, a police officer ran over to me and stated, God damn it, get out of here, get them out of here. Your 15 minutes are up, we're sending the crew in.
So the reason why these cases of history are interesting to me, 50s, 60s, 70s, civil rights, counterculture, anti-war movement, COINTELPRO, Operation Chaos, FBI informants, the reason why I care in a narrative which is designed to be about the war on terror, a mass event that took place during my early childhood, which largely shaped and dictated the coordinates of the political grid that I would exist on as an adult. The reason why I start by analyzing cases that are further in the past is that the settled history is settled. It gives us a model for what we can reasonably expect in the future. We don't know what the NSA is doing right now. We don't know what the CIA is doing right now. But it has been a historical truism for me, and you might ask yourself whether you agree, but I would find that, barring some very complicated theory, the best guide to predicting future behavior is past actions. And by analyzing the past actions that we know about, that are settled, and there is so much more that we do not know about, and so many stories even here that we do not have time to tell, I think you can make a case that given some of the people who have had access to surveillance data, phone calls today, now emails, instant messages, and so forth, metadata, that maybe we should not be building an enormous collection apparatus, which is now in the hands of an American government that is perched on the edge of a civil war. One of the points that is emphasized over and over again in Barton Gellman's book is that Edward Snowden did not provide the documentation in PRISM that showed the mass illegal NSA wiretapping in order to force a point about whether surveillance is worth it or not worth it. Snowden's own personal perspective is that this isn't worth it, which is why he essentially blew his own life up in order to make these documents known to the public. But what Snowden emphasizes over and over again in justifying his decision to take highly classified documents which do involve methods and sources used in the collection of foreign and domestic intelligence. And these methods of data collection, I think you could potentially tell a feasible story about how they might be used to defeat a terrorist plot or some form of violent conspiracy. But Snowden believed that in a democracy, the debate about the limits of power in the government belongs in the public sphere. And because the NSA had classified all of its operative manuals, in other words, all of the pieces of software, all of the protocols, even the legal interpretations of the law. For example, in Dark Mirror, Gellman talks about how there are secret legal memos that say what information can and can't be collected, under what conditions can an American citizen be the target of NSA surveillance, under what conditions can the NSA share information about these citizens with CIA, FBI, and so forth, local police. And the public isn't allowed to know what any of those legal actions were. It's as if the Supreme Court had interpreted a, Second Amendment challenge in the form of the right to carry a weapon and so forth, but then the ruling was secret. And then you could be pulled over by a cop for having a gun, not having a gun, whatever, and they'd say you're under arrest for this, this, and this. And you'd say, I don't remember a law being passed about that. And they would say, oh no, the Supreme Court made a decision. And then you would say, well, I don't remember a Supreme Court decision either. And then the cop would say, oh, well, it's a secret interpretation actually, but you are going to prison now. This is essentially what the NSA helped itself to in terms of the mass wiretapping of American citizens. Oh, we have a DOJ memo that says that under the authority granted by the president to himself, what would eventually be called the unitary executive theory, or just to put it more plainly, the Führer principle, the principle of dictatorial power. Under the authority granted to the executive, we can, of course, in times of war, which we are always in as an empire, in times of war we can and will surveil any American citizen who has a known contact with anyone believed to be engaged in terrorist activities. And you go, I guess that means just about everyone, considering the way that network graphs and relationships work, and the fact that these connections do not have to withstand legal scrutiny. There are very few, if any, cases in history of which I am aware in which the government voluntarily gives up a power which it has recently invented and enjoys using. There are very few government agencies that I can think of that, once created, decide themselves to be unnecessary and simply go away. There is massive inertia in the national security state. One of the consequences of the post 9/11 shift in American domestic and foreign policy is that we created a literal national security state. We went from a regime where an already enormous number of people, something like 250,000, had some form of secret government clearance. In other words, government employees, government contractors working on sensitive operations and so forth. Just a sort of stick it in their thermometer to see how much of a police state we are. It went from something like 250,000 in 2000, and by 2010, it was over 2 million. We had developed an enormous system of interlocking command and control structures designed to gather information about the public, store it in searchable databases, and then make those databases accessible to different government agencies. In other words, the CIA wanted to see the FBI's homework. The FBI wanted to see what the CIA had on foreign nationals visiting the United States and so forth. And part of the reason why these government agencies were so intent on going from what they called a need-to-know basis for the exchange of information, it's pre-9/11, to a need-to-share, in other words, developing the ability to look at each other's information and reporting and so forth, is because they had fucked up so badly, at least if you believe it was a simple coincidence or accident, that they had failed to notice, for example, prior to 9/11 in August of 2001, that individuals on a CIA terror watch list had come into the United States and had checked into a hotel in San Diego using their real name and so forth, and that they had moved into a house down the street from where I live in San Diego. There's literally an apartment in Lemon Grove, which is still there, where 9/11 was planned. And part of that planning was done in a house that was ran by an FBI informant. And so individuals that had been under government surveillance had made contact with FBI informants and had generated, to, I suppose, the FBI's credit, reports with titles like Bin Laden determined to strike inside of United States. All of this was not acted upon, and the public, quite understandably, I think, was pissed. And so the government did not want to be in a position any longer in which they could be accused of not doing everything and anything they could imagine to stop the next terrorist attack. And because information was flowing so freely through these networks, it allowed a certain Army intelligence officer stationed at a forward operating base in eastern Baghdad to create the largest leak of government secrets that the world has ever seen. And so, on the next episode of our War on Terror series, we will be looking at the life and times of one Chelsea Manning and her contacts with a certain crazy white-haired Aussie who very recently has been let out of prison after years and years and years of being incarcerated without trial.
How sweet it is, the circumstances and the law and the abuse of law behind my 5.5 years of detention without charge in this country. I am tough, I am hardened by this process, in fact, and I can take it. However, what right does this government, or the US government, or the Swedish government have to deny my children their father for 5.5 years without any charges in any country? And it is time that they had their father back.